Hi, welcome to another edition of our look at America and the dream that it took to make America free, our dream of freedom, if you will. We're going back in the pages of history to look at some defining moments that remind us of how much God really did have a hand in the creation of this American experiment and how important that is as we continue to strive to fulfill that dream that came from those founding fathers. In the 1740s, if you go back in history, the American colonies became a rope in a tug-o-war between Britain and France. One of the harshest periods of conflict took place between the years of 1744 to 1748, nearly 30 years before the Declaration of Independence. In the midst of the conflict, in October of 1746, the people of Boston heard with alarm that the French admiral was preparing to sail his fleet from Nova Scotia into Boston Harbor to attack the city and ravage New England. It was the largest naval armada that had ever made the trip to threaten the American coastline. As a result, the governor of Massachusetts had no adequate way to protect Boston, which was the jewel, I guess, of American cities at that time historically, or the 15,000 people that lived there. The French were on their way to burn the city to the ground. Sunday, October 16th, 1746, was a day that was set aside in the city of Boston as a day of citywide prayer and fasting. And so citizens packed and gathered into the city's churches. Hundreds of them crowded into the historic Old South Meeting House. The only pleasant thing that day was the weather, which was peaceful and calm. But there was no peace to be found for the people who lived in Boston. The pastor of the Old South Church was Reverend Thomas Prince. He was a powerful voice in a period of history called the Great Awakening. He was a friend of George Whitefield and a man of prayer. As he climbed into the pulpit that day, Reverend Prince earnestly interceded on behalf of the colonists. His prayer? Deliver us from our enemy. He prayed that over and over again. He said, "Send thy tempest, Lord, upon the waters to the eastward. Raise thy right hand, scatter the ships of our tormentors, and drive them away." According to history, suddenly there was a gust of wind that was so powerful that the shutters of the church itself banged, startling the congregation. Reverend Prince paused, looked up in surprise. Sunlight had disappeared on that day, which had started so calmly, and there were gathering storm clouds. Taking a minute and gathering his thoughts at his prayer being answered so quickly, Reverend Prince then continued with even greater enthusiasm, saying, "Sink their proud frigates beneath the power of thy winds." And gusts of winds began to pick up and blow harder that day in the city of Boston. Raising his hands toward heaven, Reverend Prince bellowed, "We hear your voice, O Lord, we hear it. Thy breath is upon the waters to the eastward, even upon the deep. The bell tolls for the death of our enemies." That day, on October 16th of 1746, a hurricane force struck the French ships. The bulk of the army, navy, if you will, was sunk that day in the harbor. Only a few sailors survived. A book was written that describes this, The Anatomy of a Naval Disaster. And in describing this, it says not a single French military objective had been achieved on that day. Thousands of soldiers and sailors were dead. No one knows how many men died during the expedition. Some estimate the range as high as 8,000 casualties that day. Back in Boston, the governor followed up the day of prayer with a day of thanksgiving. There was no end to the joyful phrase that was repeated over and over again. If God is with us, who can be against us? And the town celebrated. In Romans chapter 8, verses 31 through 32, Paul asks that very same question. What shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who can stand against us? He who did not spare his own son, but delivered him up for us all, how shall he not be with him and freely give us all things? Also, in nearby Braintree, on that never-to-be-forgotten day, a child named John Adams knelt with his family and listened to his father also utter the prayer. For this most timely evidence of his favor, we give thanks. It is a day that marks the history of America and kept the dream for freedom alive, October 16th, 1746. Not often talked about anymore in history books, certainly not the stuff of history lessons, but a powerful reminder that if God is for us, who can be against us? Those words in Romans still have meaning to this day. And for any American who is willing to embrace and remember the heritage that we have come from, is a powerful reminder that God is not done with this nation. And for people who will look toward heaven, there is direction, and there's guidance, and there's a rudder of how to navigate this crazy world that we live in. You and I are keepers of that dream. And so as we chase that dream of freedom, remember to keep your eyes on God. And remember the prayer that sunk a navy that day in October 1746. I look forward to joining you for our next look back through the quarters of time as we keep the dream of freedom alive.